Hello and welcome to the latest episode of Security Noise, Farewell 2024, where we will take some time to look over the main events and trends of this year and maybe make some embarrassing predictions. Today we have Perez with us, who is the leader of IR at TrustedSec, as well as the host of the Tech Brief. And of course, I have our producer, Skyler Tuter, as well, who will make sure the show sounds great and hopefully keep us on track a little bit and keep us honest about our predictions. And with that, we will go straight into it today. So guys, the first trend I think we should probably discuss is, cyber warfare and how that has changed over the past year, or maybe kind of continued since 2023, depending on your perspectives. But I think some of the major observations that I've made really are it's no longer theoretical. We're seeing these attacks in the real world. People are doing them. It's no longer a game of plausible deniability. Various threat actors, whether it's Ukraine or Russia or even North Korea, they're openly taking credit for, what they've done out there in terms of cyber warfare now.
Yeah, that's true. And I remember when the war at Ukraine started, we saw the Russians throwing everything they could without any type of organization out there. And now what we're seeing is that the attacks are more, for example, they'll hack into IP cameras. Same thing as from the Ukrainians. Ukrainians will hack into IP cameras. And they'll use that to do damage assessments on artillery and attacks. So that's something new. We now see them going out and putting communications like, hey, turn off your IP cameras or disconnect your connections if you're in an area that got attacked. So we're seeing new ways that this is playing a role out there. We are seeing a lot of wipers. We are seeing that mixture of ransomware crews and state actors, where all of a sudden now we know that we always suspected that they worked together, but now we know that they work together, given the attacks that we're seeing happening out there. So it's, when it comes to all of that, it's very interesting what we're seeing, how it's evolving and adapting, especially from that side, since they're getting a lot of practice on each other. So that's why I kind of like going into the Ukraine CERT website and just reading the different reports that they put out there. It shows that their use of YubiKeys for all authentication in their government is actually working and is hampering some of the operations, shifting how the Russians are now changing how they perform all of their different techniques and procedures when they attack. So it's a very interesting time when you start looking at all of those reports and all of those write-ups.
And it's not just hacking into devices or getting into, publicly accessible cams and stuff like that. But now with the advancement of AI technology and being able to deep fake voices and images and videos, you're getting into a lot of what, sounds scarier, but we're getting into PsyOps territory where these hacker groups are generating, propaganda,
or North Korean IT workers. Like you call support, and now you can get a North Korean helping you troubleshoot your machine, probably.
Gee, that's convenient.
Or maybe they're applying for the job to replace the guy next to you who's retiring.
True.
You never know who you're going to get on the phone. But you look at social media and how people in different demographics seem to be more siloed now with social media just because of these types of efforts, whether it be a country or an activist group, or we'll say hacktivist group. People are now being kind of put in their own demographical silos of information, and they're just being fed what the algorithms have told these groups. These people want to know, will want to be told these things. And so then they're generating that type of content that affirms or progresses certain trains of thought.
I've even seen it with my kids in YouTube.
Yep.
Like the other day, so my daughter has seen me be very pro-Ukraine, and she saw me having a patch with the Ukrainian flag in my backpack. So she started searching for all of that stuff. And all of a sudden, when I turn on my Apple TV a couple of days later, all of the videos that are being recommended are about Ukraine, curse, and all of that stuff. And I'm like, why? And then when I look at the history of videos, is that my daughter grabbed the Apple TV at the other room that is with my same account for YouTube Premium, and she just started just watching video after video because she saw the flag in my backpack, and I gave her that flag for her backpack for school, and she just started going through all of those. Now the algorithm's only feeding her those types of videos, and all of it is, even though I support Ukraine, is the propaganda side of the pro-Ukrainian side.
Right.
So you can see some of the videos and go like, no, you should diverse in what you're seeing. The algorithms feeding her that. So we see it everywhere. So it's not only you going like, oh, I don't want this content, block it, which isolates you at the same time. But you're also telling the algorithm, don't give them a different point of view. Let's keep feeding them what they have been trying to watch right now.
Right. Yeah. You don't need to be hacked to be susceptible or vulnerable to hacktivists.
Yeah.
Well, and it's definitely interesting too how that algorithmic technology and the data mining is being used. Certainly there's a lot of Silicon Valley right now, and some major companies, not to name names or anything, but they're gathering up that data and they're making predictions about where the hotspots and stuff will be when the attacks will occur. And certainly governments. I mean, U.S. military is making no secret of the fact that they're buying this intelligence data that's being generated that way. So that I think has accelerated a lot this year. And the other thing is kind of the intersection between some of the stuff in kinetic warfare. A lot of the same predictive technology is being rolled into drones and things like that. So they're, doing things like operating swarms and stuff without GPS, hitting the battlefield for the first time. That's going to be a big shift, I think. Certainly we've seen a lot of conventional weapons and how that's intersecting with legacy purchases, especially in the Russia-Ukraine conflict, I think, because, you have a peer in that conflict that probably did a lot of their military planning and asset purchases around, what the world looked like 20 years ago when drones were, large fixed wing things that, were controlled by a person on the other side of the world. And, they're coming up against, small drones that are, in many cases, AI controlled already. And that has been very impactful.
And I was discussing this with a friend of mine. So I'm a Marine Corps auxiliary, so I'm an instructor for Marfor Cyber. And I was talking with a friend of mine, Major Ireland, over there back in the day before he left. And he was saying, like, just look at Azerbaijan. He brought that war to me, a bunch of articles where there were already, before Ukraine, a lot of drones that were using AI to identify vehicles and attack those. And they played a very key role in the drones that were used, that Israel provided to one of the sides of that war, that helped them kind of like push the tide of the armor and everything. It's going like, dude, just wait and see. Everybody's ignoring this article because every military out there preps to fight the last war they fought. They don't see ahead of the possible war they're going to fight. And Ukraine was a perfect example. They started flying drones. 900 megahertz was what they were using for FPV. That started getting blocked. They moved over to 2 and 5 gigahertz. That started getting blocked. The Russians started putting actual fiber optic rolls on the drones and using that. And now what we're seeing is that all of the drones just have kind of like a AI and an image detection on this is the type of vehicle that you're going to attack, or this is the type of structure that you're going to, or the path that you're going to follow. Because now we're seeing a bunch of GPS being blocked or jammed. And the US decided like, okay, we don't need this amount of artillery shells because we have our smart shells with GPS. And we gave a bunch of those to Ukraine, and then the Russians started jamming GPS. And now those don't work so much. And the guys back in the US started going like, so all of that production, we stopped doing regular shells. Now we need regular dump shells. And we're seeing it also on the cyber side. So I have a friend who I won't mention from what company he works at, but he just, as one of his side projects, he grabbed a bunch of two NVIDIA's 4080s, I think. He set up an LLM for an implant that he's developing for his consultancy that actually has a bunch of models that they feed what their red team sees in terms of this is what CrowdStrike detects if it is this version and it's configured this way. So they started creating a bunch of post-enumeration processes that then feed that over to their C2 server that then go over to one server they have where they have all of that runs against Llama 3, I think, from Google and all of those LLMs. And it provides railguards over for their operators as they're performing engagements. That goes like, this is some ways that you can persist that we know won't get you detected. Don't do this and this and this. And you try to run a command on the C2 and it will give you a warning and ask you for confirmation if you want to run it or not. And he's starting to play with that. I'm going like, this is a single guy. What are we going to see now from nation states out there when they start investing in all of this and automating a lot of the low-hanging fruit and a lot of those processes in the way that they attack and do stuff?
Well, and we should mention before we move on the pager attacks in terms of cyber warfare, because I do want to move on to LLMs, but certainly that was a major event this year that I think we gotta speak to a little bit. Yeah. And the big takeaway on that one is just how critical I think the consumer-oriented communications networks have become in most of these global conflicts. I mean, it's not new in that traditional cellular networks and stuff were being used to coordinate and stuff like that. But just the fact that a foreign intelligence agency was able to effectively use that distribution channel, that consumer-oriented telecom equipment, to basically wipe out the terrorist networks, their enemy terrorist networks, communications that way. Pretty amazing. A lot of planning and a lot of interesting cyber nexus there as far as, the command and control pieces of that to make that work. Did you guys have any thoughts on that one? Are we going to see something like that again, or was that a one-off?
I think that will be kind of like a role model or a roadmap that we're going to see for engagements that are not near peer in types of engagements. So what we saw was that the Israelis initially just started going after all of their cell phones for the communication. They were getting hacked, they were getting information, they were using triangulation and their GPSs and all of the information to target those. So they then started moving over to radios and also to pagers, and they were able to intercept those. And now they're moving with couriers, which more than likely there'll be a drone or something watching the courier as he moves into a car and moves somewhere else to try to track that. So we're seeing how it is evolving in the way that they behave. We saw it also in Ukraine, where all of a sudden there was this application that was being used by the artillery guys on the Ukrainian side in their Android devices. That got hacked, that got backdoored. So the Russians all of a sudden started noticing where were all of these units in Ukraine that were using their artillery units for counter-artillery barrages. We saw it also from the Ukrainian side to the Russian side, because when the Russians came in, all of a sudden all of their cell phones were connecting to Ukrainian towers. Now we know where they're moving because they started moving back with their cell phones. And then as they were getting roaming and connecting back to Russia, they were looking at all of that stuff. And the perfect example of all of this is Telegram. When they arrested the Telegram CEO in France, Russia freaked out. A lot of black markets in Asia freaked out completely because all of them were running on Telegram. Like Russia was using it for communications in the battlefield. In Singapore and China, a lot of full black markets from buying advertising, stuff that we see in dark web on the eastern side. In Asia, was very common to use actually Telegram for all of that stuff. And they start freaking out. So we're seeing kind of like that reliance and how you can actually kind of like just throw a wrench into the process of all of this.
That's interesting because, I can understand most organizations end up kind of using something like Telegram, Signal, those types of things, mostly because everybody has them. They know how to get them. Mm-hmm. You don't have to train folks. But I mean, when you're a military. You can tell people what to do. It doesn't seem to me that it would be difficult to assign people, some sort of identifier number. Maybe you already use their serial number that they've been assigned already, and throw together a little app, and tell everybody to install it. I mean,
Yeah.
I'm surprised that was as impactful as it was. I mean, absolutely, it clearly was. I mean, we can, anybody can see that from, OSINT and just the news coverage of it. But I still find it weird.
And you see it from, here's where having good design and usable design of gear comes into play. Like on the Russian side, their radios, the ways that they're programmed, and you put your keys into them for encryption, and how you do all of your encrypted material handling, all of that stuff is very old, very convoluted. At its heart, it's not easy. And then you look at the Western side with your Harris radio, and everything's all set up, and you can the radio guy can grab everybody's radio and just program the key for that day that they're going to be using for encrypted communications. On the Russian side, they didn't have all of that. It was very convoluted. It was not advanced. And then they found that, hey, if we use Telegram, it's easier for us to just communicate and go like, move here, where's this unit? Oh, I saw this. Than just trying to even use their own gear, because their gear was not designed to be very user-friendly. And that's where all of that design comes into play, and on how it's friction. It's just the same with security tools. It's friction. Like everybody and their mother puts in an EDR into an enterprise environment, and all of them can be bypassed by Rundle32. Why? Because vendors decided that Rundle32 is used by so many programs in so many ways that they just don't want to create a bunch of false positives that cause friction to the user. That they go like, oh, this EDR is crap because it's giving me a bunch of false positives. So what do they do? In their default config, they allow Rundle32. They allow a bunch of stuff because they don't want to trigger those false positives, because they don't want that friction. So all of a sudden you have a non-very reliable system, so they won't upset the customer. And they put the burden on the customer to tweak their EDR, to make it more, to detect more stuff, to tune out what is the normal behavior in the environment. It's like when I do an IR. I go into an IR, the environment uses a lot of PowerShell, they use PSXec, they do a lot of stuff. Now I got to do deconfliction. There's a lot of friction for me as I'm processing all of our Velociraptor captures and trying to see what is sysadmin work and what is hacker in that environment.
Well, let's go on to our next topic then, and I'll segue this way, Carlos. Maybe you can use some LLM to help you write your next book on how UX won the war. But
Actually,
what are some things we want to say about large language models, and maybe some of the video stuff like Stable Diffusion that we saw in 2024?
I think we've covered quite a bit of it, like what I mentioned with the C2. He's using LLMs, where he's feeding all of the information about what the guys are seeing out there, putting it into their database, and then having it learn and crunch it so it can give them rail guards. We see it in the Koreans using it for videos, to get interviews, to get there. I think it has lowered the bar when it comes to all of this type of social engineering attacks, at least for what we're seeing most of the use for. Because before we could tell, like, this is fishy. They misspelled this, or this email doesn't look right. Now with LLMs, you just feed them a bunch of the proper stuff, and it will spit out something that is a lot more believable. So we're seeing it there. Now we see every vendor include AI as part of their solution. SentinelOne, Microsoft, and many others. And then you try to use them. They're not there yet, but I could see them in hunting if the LLM can actually just crunch numbers and learn about them. Well, yes, we can see it with CrowdStrike. Like, what's the service that they have where they monitor stuff? I forgot the name. So I know that CrowdStrike feeds a lot of the telemetry back to the cloud. and around
I mean, that's kind of their thing, but you know.
30 to 70. I think 30% of the processing happens on client. You disconnect it from the internet, and the other 70% happens only in the cloud. But in the cloud, what they're doing is that they're feeding from every other customer what they're seeing. So we see it in our red team engagements where the guys will use a tool and they'll generate a payload, and they're using that. If they make the mistake of not rekeying and repackaging one of the payloads for another customer, they'll get caught because it was already used at another customer that was using CrowdStrike. And then when you go to the other one, CrowdStrike already knows about that hash, knows already about those imports and how it's behaving. And it then triggers at the other side. We are seeing it also with Microsoft Defender. Microsoft's using LLMs on the backside for a lot of the Defender signatures that they're using, and their detection rates are improving. All of a sudden, now you see a lot of less red teamers out there sharing tools or sharing payloads because they know that they'll get burned within 24 hours, 48 hours once they start being used en masse by multiple people. So we're seeing LLMs changing the defensive side. We're seeing it changing the offensive side. It's not radical change, but it is impactful change to a certain degree in certain areas, I would say.
Wonder if that will kind of almost roll back the clock a little bit on some of the, I would say, radical sharing that we have seen in the industry over the past decade. I mean, most people write something that's straight onto GitHub as far as, you know, the proof of concepts and stuff goes. I wonder if it will cause people to kind of close up a little bit.
Still happens. You put a POC, within 24 hours, there's massive scanning out there and exploitation as soon as you put a POC out there. The way I tell customers is that you have all of these researchers that are kind of like putting that go, it is for educational purposes. And it's like me putting that sticker for educational purposes only on an AK-47 and putting it on the sidewalk and go like, this is for educational purposes only. I don't care what happens with it.
I mean, that's how you know when you have a good tutorial on YouTube is when somebody has to preface with, this is for educational purposes only.
Yeah.
Well, it's interesting, too, to look at the more user-facing end of the LLM stuff. You know, we're starting to see it on websites. It's the customer service agent. It's the advisor. You know, it's the
coding
shopping assistant. And I think there's going to be a lot of footgun moments, you know, which was kind of, I think, my prediction last year, but it's taken longer than I expected to start to see them. We have seen SQL injection via LLM now, so that was neat. And a few other things, so some agency concerns and stuff like that. Lots of the jailbreaking, obviously, and fundamentally, you know, it still comes down to the you know, control channel and the data channel is you know, unified on these things, and so even a well-designed app is going to have challenges there. So I look forward to seeing kind of more of that next year and to kind of keep playing with that as an app tester.
I already use it for scripting, for getting very quick scripts out there. I just go. I've learned how to do the prompt for what I want.
Okay.
How I want the script to be. I've already learned it with both Copilot and Claude. And I just go like, I want a script. The script will take this input. I want you to process it this way. And then my output should look like this. And then I just give it the JSON or whatever it is going to be the input and a sample output. And I tell it, give it to me in PowerShell and Python. And it outputs, and at least with Claude, I'm getting 8 out of 10 times it works from the first go.
Okay.
And then the other 2, I just got to tweak it a bit. Like, oh, I got this error, or I got this other thing. Also for data processing, I just can give it a bunch of CSV files or PDFs. Then I just start asking questions about it.
Yeah, I've tried some of Meta's models and CodeGemma and a few others locally, and I got very frustrated with it because even though mostly I'm writing, you know, trash code that I don't care about, I'm going to run it once because I just want to generate 1,000 messages with this structure or something like that to throw at a website. I still found that, you know, it would just, unless I spent as much time explaining to it all the various corner cases, like, and if there are no records, you know, let's not, you know, throw an error or have a a null reference and those kind of problems that I was just like, you know what, I'm just going to go back to writing code myself.
The way I see it is every model has its advantages. Like ChatGPT, I'll use it when, given that English is not my first language, I'll go to it and say, can you polish this? Give it to me in an active voice or in the style of this other person, in a more proper manner or anything like that. And it helps me a lot. Claude, not that well. But when it comes to code, ChatGPT most often sucks. I just go to Claude from Anthropic, and it nails it every time when it comes to code. So I think each one has kind of like its ups and downs. It's like, what's the Google Notebook, Notebook LM? That is great for research. I just give it a bunch of threat intel reports, and I just start asking it questions about it. What is the top technique mapped to MITRE? And it gives me all the top techniques of all of the reports mapped to MITRE. And I'm like, oh, awesome. But which I cannot do with the others. The problem is that all of a sudden now you have 3 different subscriptions and you're spending $60 a month. So it's a value proposition, I think.
So how about quality of software in the security industry itself, whether we're talking CrowdStrike or CrowdStrike, or Edge network equipment? Some of those CVs maybe were dated 2023, but the news really broke in the beginning of this year. But obviously, Palo Alto's had a bunch of more RCEs recently. We've saw Ivanti, we've seen NetScaler bugs, that were all fairly serious. And a lot of these types of problems were either unauthenticated and they were stuff like SQLi, or they were stuff like rather simple bypasses. It looks like maybe somebody left some test code in or something like that. For an industry that, you'd like to think they have their supply chain ducks in a row and that they would have, the strongest secure coding practices and stuff like that in place. They don't seem to. Are we going to see changes at all?
Unless they feel the pain, they won't. Like, for example, when I do the tech briefs, every tech brief, Ivanti, then Fortinet, Ivanti, Fortinet. Then from time to time, Palo Alto. But Ivanti has been the whipping boy for a very long time in terms of vulnerabilities. Then you have Fortinet. We've worked many cases where Fortinet was the main point of access of the attacker. We're working cases where Palo Alto is the main point of attackers. And then and this is the part that worries me, is that when we do, for example, onboarding of customers for retainers, or we do tabletop exercises with customers, or we're working on an engagement, and I go to them and ask them, do you at least ingest the logs for the admin interface? Who logs in, who logs off, and configuration changes for these devices? I haven't found one single customer that does.
Really?
Which worries me. And then
that is stunning.
And then we even have cases where the ransomware crew is trying to get into the backup system and they cannot get in. So what do? They look at, brocade switches, silkworms, management interface, default password, let's go in, list lungs, let's delete the lungs. So all of a sudden your immutable backup system, not so immutable if I can get to the fiber channel switches and do my stuff from there from the controller. But on the edge side, we don't see it like. And then you go and you try to find documentation on how to collect logs, what to look for. Outside of Cisco, I haven't seen it that much. And the part that irks me the most is Ivanti, and sorry for picking on them, but when you put out a patch and then you tell the customer like, this patch is for this series of devices, we'll put the other patch for this other series in 2-3 days, and then in 3 to 4 days, we'll get the other series of devices. Well, it's being massively exploited even before you found out. And there's proof of concept code out there on how to exploit it. And you have to wait for that patch to be there. and you have to implement mitigations. Like it's kind of like, yeah, the vendors are not doing a very good job. They're not feeling the pain that much because customers still buy it. Like I had a customer that
we've certainly seen that with CrowdStrike.
Yeah, and then from the other side, from our side, I think we've over focused on Windows. We have ignored Linux, IoT devices, and when it comes to the edge, we've ignored it completely.
Well, I mean, I think everybody has the attitude, hey, this is, my hardened security device. It is the Sentinel. I shouldn't have to be watching it. But, obviously that is ridiculous. But,
All of it runs
it's understandable that to some extent why you would have that attitude. I mean, it's supposed to be the wolf guarding the hen house. So
no, from the point of view, from your side, which is applications, when we look at a lot of these bugs, for me from the outside, just being a scripter, they look like kind of like dumb bugs that proper code reviews should catch it, like Git hooks or stuff like that, or just linters should catch some of this stuff, or proper testing, like Palo Alto was just put in the header, no auth, and I was in.
Yeah.
How hard is it for a developer to implement some of these checks?
Well, I mean, I don't necessarily think that a SAST tool looking at headers is going to have patterns or training to detect a backdoor like that, just because it's not a common error. It's something that somebody would have deliberately done. So I don't think they will have ever been trained necessarily to find it. However, that is exactly the kind of thing that I would hope a code review or any kind of pair programming or anything like that would catch. So it does tell me that there isn't a lot of testing or there isn't a lot of peer validation going on where there probably should be. And I do think, too, that some of the AI training, the LLMs, the large language models and things like that, we should be able to probably train those to look for backdoors in the future, because they do have certain patterns like that. No. Even though I think the current generation SaaS tool is probably going to fall down on something like that. But certainly, we've seen hard-coded passwords and things like that in the past from a lot of these vendors, even fairly recently. And I would say every SaaS tool in the past 10 years ought to have a, high entropy detection and spot something that looks like any kind of hard-coded key or anything like that in it. And so to me, some of those types of problems are just kind of really inexcusable. And I mean, then you get back to stuff like logging, and I do assume that most of these devices probably are generating some of those login events and stuff like that. But, whenever we used to teach a secure coding class for TrustedSec, one of the first things, I talked about when we discussed logging and monitoring was, well, one of the very, very first things anybody running a SIEM in your security team is going to ask for is every authentication event. And I don't care what you're authenticating, whether it's a person, another machine, a message, anything. If you're authenticating something, it's probably worth logging it. And doesn't sound like maybe that's happening in some of the security realm on either the device vendor side or maybe some of the default rule sets and stuff that come with the SIEM products.
And they should know better. I still remember when I worked at Tenable. I was the director of development for all of the plugins, reverse engineering, 0 days, all of that stuff. I wasn't a coder, but I worked with the QA team. I remember when my developers wrote code, it went to the QA team. The QA team looked at the code, ran the code, found stuff, and all of a sudden they would dispatch that to a series of coders that they had in QA that would update linters for the plugin writers. It will also update Git hooks that would run. And so when you try to commit to the development branch, it wouldn't let you because it did a bunch of checks before for previously known vulnerabilities that were found or errors that were found. And they had kind of like that process built in. And I don't see those best practices in other vendors, which sometimes worry me because we've seen it with Ivanti, we've seen it with Fortinet. We've seen it with Palo Alto. We've seen it with Cisco. We've seen it with almost every vendor. We saw it with CrowdStrike, like testing with a Perl script. If it passes check and then goes straight into production. Yeah, we need to do better. Like we're what's the story? The emperor without clothes.
Yes, the Emperor's New Clothes. Mm-hmm. Yeah, it certainly feels like that sometimes. And I mean, just sometimes as part of the industry, you're like, "Ah, really? I feel just sort of embarrassed for all of us."
Yeah. Yeah. The
So
CrowdStrike. Now I mentioned CrowdStrike, and everybody knows what CrowdStrike is.
yeah. What was it? PT Barnum? There's no such thing as bad publicity. Well, with that ransomware, Lockbit, Change Healthcare, that kind of stuff, certainly some of these devices have been the avenue for that, as you mentioned. Are we going to see, any real progress made on that in the next year?
I believe so. And we're seeing it right now in the way that ransomware actors are changing. So before it was they would get in, they would enumerate as much as possible, and they were encrypt, and then you pay them. Then EDR started getting a bit better. So now what you have is double extortion. So they would go in, they would exfil as many data as possible because they know that there was insurance. They would encrypt and then blackmail you to get you to pay for the insurance because now you can leverage that insurance. Now EDRs have gotten a lot better. Now there are sanctions for many of these actors depending on the country they are. So right now what they're moving is to a pure extortion type of business. So all of a sudden, when it comes to your typical EDR and solution out there, they'll detect the encryption, they'll detect the persistence, or somebody trying to gain admin to be able to spread across multiple hosts, like get to the ntds.dead, extract a password that is used by management software, responder to get the NTLM hash and replay it, or attack a DCS. It's getting a lot better. So now they're going as a regular user, I can still go after a file share. I can still enumerate all of that stuff. And a lot of these products actually suck when it comes to detecting that. Me going into a file share and enumerating stuff to exfiltrate it, package it, and then put it out there. So now we're seeing a shift in behavior. And I think that we'll keep seeing changes in behavior, and it will still be a cat and mouse game. But I'm really curious what we'll see next. Where will they go next in that? Because business email compromise is still bigger than ransomware.
Mm-hmm.
The thing is that ransomware makes more than news. Like right now, if I look at our application for looking at all of the stuff that my team's working, for every insider actor, for every hacked edge device, we have 4 to 5 business email compromises. Like, wow. Beck is our bread and butter inside of the IR team right now.
And is the motivation usually just fraud, or is it? Are you seeing more things, political motivation, things like that, or
more fraud? So what we'll see is that they'll do either two main things. One of them is that you'll get a prompt for consent to an application, so they can get a primary refresh token that they can then refresh and use to maintain access to your environment. The other one is that they'll set up EvilNex with a reverse proxy so they can get your MFA and authenticate so they can get a token. So they'll use one or two. And they'll mainly target MSPs so they can get after all of those customers. Or they'll target one organization and use their SharePoint after enumerating all of the mailboxes and the emails and how they do stuff to then use those SharePoints as staging places to attack other organizations. And many times what we see is that they'll either go through SharePoint, OneDrive, or they'll even plug in commercial backup software to the mailboxes and back them up completely, and then just go through rummaging through the backups for documentations to extort. And once they get a very nice feeling on how you operate and how you do your invoicing and stuff, they'll start requesting changes to accounts, or they'll start blackmailing you with the information that is there. And a lot of that stuff actually doesn't get into the news or even gets reported to law enforcement. Because the problem is that the FBI has a portal So when somebody, all of a sudden you do a transfer and you lose a lot of money and you find out within 24 hours to 48 hours, you can go into a portal, open a ticket with them, and they have already connections to the bank accounts, so they can stop that. Problem is that they are finding out 2 or 3 weeks later when the guy that they supposedly paid to goes like, hey, you owe me money and you haven't paid in 2 months. Oh yeah, we did. We did the transfer to this account. You even sent me an email on it. And they're going like, we never sent you that email. And the email has the proper headers, the proper wording. So I bet that they're using LLMs for some of that stuff to get the wording to sound like the other person, to convince them to do all of those changes. So we're seeing a lot of business email compromise. And Microsoft with their weird licensing doesn't make it a lot easier. No. Google with their bad tooling for Google Workspace also makes it even worse to try to find stuff that is going on. But yeah, business email compromise happens a lot. Like last Monday, I think we got 3 calls for that. Then we got another one on Tuesday, and then we got another one after Thanksgiving. That's just last week.
I'm going to bet we see a lot more of that coming into the following year. We are running a little short of time here, so I'm going to let Skyler run us quick through our last topic, China and the decoupling. Obviously, both on the Chinese leadership side and certainly the American leadership side, there seems to be tremendous pressure to do things like RISC-V and stuff like that, whether they're banning it or building it to sort of bifurcate the technical landscape. Are we going to see that trend continuing or not?
I don't know. I think we're going to see a progression for sure. It's kind of hard to tell. I think, again, not to get too political, but we are in a change of administration over the next several months, and so I think depending on how that administration is going to handle our relationship with China right now, I think that's going to be kind of a deciding factor. So I want to remain cautiously optimistic, but it's kind of a wait and see, I think, right now for the next several months, just to kind of see what the temperature is going to look like.
So right now, we with the CHIPS Act and everything that's going on, most of the chips that are created are in Taiwan. So that means that if China invades Taiwan, that will affect the global market of everything. Mm-hmm. Smart cars, cell phones, all of that stuff. And then you have the problem that you're trying to bring those foundries back to their respective countries, like the US. Korea has some foundries, others have others, but they're expensive. Yeah. I believe like Taiwan actually was the one that foresaw that future, and they decided like this is a differentiator that we can do to keep us safe, and they played it very well. Like the guy, and it was a plan from the guy that created TMC, I believe, and kudos to him. But it shows what we have been seeing also on our side with supply chain attacks, like NPM packages. Like, yeah, there was. I remember there was a. Geoff, what was the NPM package that was 10 lines, and the guy decided to kill it and broke almost every other NPM package that relied on it? I think that was with NPM,
logging
right?
Package or something, wasn't it?
I think so. Like we saw it there, and if you go into GitHub, they have kind of like their advisories. And you look at the amount of PyPy and NPM packages that they go like have malware in them. I think it was around 150 to 200 per day that they're flagging in GitHub. So I think we're seeing kind of like that supply chain attacks that we were seeing on the open source code side. I think we're seeing it now with chips and hardware. It's going to be interesting. I wonder what will happen on the political landscape. What can even be done?
Yeah, I don't know. Sorry, I'm pulling up Reuters right now. Other than that, I mean, it looks like Chinese companies are looking at some new restrictions. This one says they include nearly 24 semiconductor companies, 2 investment companies, and over 100 chip-making tool makers. So, this isn't as what some people on the surface level say is like, oh, it's just the chip factories getting restrictions put on. It's like, no, restrictions are getting hit on like all the ingredients,
supply chain.
Yeah, the supply chain, the people that are making the tools to make the chips are getting hit hard. People who are investing in the production of these chips are getting restrictions put on. So
now, the part that we're failing, I think, is on the knowledge on how to do it. Because I remember my daughter's at college now. She's still a daddy's girl, so I go with her to some of this stuff. And I was talking with one of the employees at the college, and she was telling me that around the U.S., the amount of Chinese studying in the U.S. is super big in engineering and coding and all of that stuff. But a lot of them actually don't stay. They just go back to China. So I think that knowledge side is something that we're not doing a very good job controlling. Same thing, who was it? So we have the knowledge on all of that, all of the engineering that is going over there. And then we have Xi Jinping that put such a large effort into the AI. And now in the top 9 companies that do AI, you have Tencent, Huawei, and I think they have 3 of the 9. The US only has kind of like Google and Meta, and now with OpenAI. So knowledge side, I think we're losing. How to build all of that stuff and retain that knowledge is something that we should take a look at and see what we can do.
I don't know. My perspective on the whole thing is I think from a security standpoint, it would be a positive development for us to have somewhat disparate, divergent tech stacks as long as parity is maintained. And that's the tricky part. But I guess we should leave it there. I want to thank Carlos for joining us today, and I want to thank all of you for listening to Security Noise. This is a production of TrustedSec LLC. If you or your organization have questions or needs regarding information security, go to www.trustedsec.com. We'll see you next time in the new year.
Thanks, everybody.